computer. Dear Earthmates, we are visiting Richard Stein or Rick Stein in the United States. We met about 15 years ago in Israel. We were both attending this wonderful Isradrama Festival, right? Am I wrong?
Yes, yes.
Yes. And we've been buddies actually since then, though we have unfortunately rarely communicated, but we, as we will share a photo, we keep smiling when we see each other.
Yes, we do. And I think, at Isradrama, although, it's a conference and the theater people were there from all over the world, and there was a set program, and there's always the opportunity to meet and get to know your colleagues from all over and make new friendships. But you and I really hit it off when we were on the tour of Jerusalem, the old city. And so the two of us were walking together in the group the whole time. And we were not paying attention to the tour guide or anything else. You and I were talking the whole time and just following the rest of the group because we were so engaged in conversation. And so that's my memory of how we first really met.
True. I know you're a person of theater, but life, L'chaim. How did your love in theater begin?
It is a very interesting story and unusual in some ways. But my father was in the United States Air Force. He was a navigator on B-47s, and we traveled a lot. We moved a lot. I was born in California, but we lived all over the United States. And we lived for 2 years in Morocco. And that was from 1960 to 1962. And when we were there, there was no television in Morocco at the time, even on the air base where we were. It was one of the more remote air bases called Sidi Slimane, which is, about an hour from Rabat. And so there was nothing to do there. And I was age 7 to age 9 while I was there. And my younger brother and I found things to do. And my mother had a collection of musical theater records, opera, classical music. And we listened to that a lot. We did puppet shows. And when my parents went to London on a trip to visit family and also to see theater, they saw My Fair Lady, which was playing in the West End at the time. And they brought back the album and the libretto. And my brother and I memorized the show and sang it. And when we moved back to the United States and arrived in New York, my parents took us to see My Fair Lady on Broadway. It was still running at that time. And my mother had to put her hand over our mouths because we kept wanting to sing during all the musical numbers since we knew them by heart. So that really kind of was the spark for my passion for theater. But ironically, it is not what I wanted to do with my life. And I went down a pathway of discovering my Jewish heritage. And although my father was in the military and we could not live a religious life, my parents did observe some of the rituals and holidays. And anyway, I was very engaged in it and thought that I might want to become a rabbi. And I went to my college years. I went to the Columbia University and the Jewish Theological Seminary with the thought that was the path I would be on. But in New York, after a very short period of time, I discovered that I didn't want the theater of the synagogue. I wanted the real theater. So, as I say, I just changed types of theater. And my little brother always wanted to be an actor, although he never did make an acting career eventually. But so that really was when I had my true education in the theater. I never studied in a theater program. I studied English literature, comparative literature, and so I focused a great deal on dramatic literature was my primary interest. And I went to my first year of college in the summer. I went home to Connecticut. I had a hard time getting a job, but I found a newspaper, a weekly newspaper in a rural community that would hire me to write theater reviews for $5 each review. And they gave me a letter. And when I went back to New York, I presented the letter to press agents of all the Broadway shows, Off-Broadway, Lincoln Center, Metropolitan Opera, and they all gave me free tickets to come in and see everything. I wasn't on the prestigious first night list, of course, but that was my education, seeing, the good, the bad, and the ugly, many brilliant productions during that era in the early 70s. There was that explosion of counterculture theater taking place on the stages, much of it, very inspired, but, not very well executed. Of course, Hair is at the pinnacle of that. Hair was, of course, kind of an iconic musical. And then, of course, the early productions of Joseph Papp and the New York Public Theater, things like David Rabe's Sticks and Bones, and that championship season. That was really my education in theater. I learned from the great directors, not by being in a master class with them, but, seeing their work on stage and becoming a very discerning critic of the stage. I was a sophomore at the time, and my reviews that I wrote were very sophomoric, as they say, very amateurish, although I read much criticism as well. It wasn't until later that I actually went into the theater, and that happened when I was a graduate student at Syracuse University in English again. And a professor of mine of dramatic literature asked me if I wanted to found a theater company with him. He had been producing some plays ad hoc, and we created together with two other people a new theater in Syracuse called Contemporary Theater of Syracuse. And there was a black box theater in the Civic Center in the city. It was a new Civic Center. So we were among the first users of it. And we put on very modest seasons, maybe 3 plays. And we did Ionesco, Pinter, Beckett, the modern classics really at that point. This was in late, I guess, 1977 or 78. Well, after a few years, my career went in another direction because that theater had no money to pay anybody. So although I was teaching part-time at the university, I really needed to get a real job. And I'll talk about that shortly. But that theater, unbelievable. That theater exists today and is thriving far beyond what we ever imagined at the time. Its name has changed. It's called the Red House. And so 40 plus years after we founded it, it still exists in Syracuse, much bigger budget, many more productions, much larger audience and support. So I feel and I've been back once to see their work. So they do very good work. I'm just very pleased because so many people who start theaters, the life of theater is, ebbs and flows with, the changing tastes of audiences. Often founder-driven theaters don't last beyond the involvement of the founder, So that was kind of interesting. But ultimately, I went on from there to become an arts administrator. I had a job running a county arts council in a rural county near Syracuse for 2 years. I was then hired by the Syracuse Symphony Orchestra to work in marketing for a year, and then by the Florida Orchestra in Tampa, Florida for a year. And I knew I loved classical music, but working in the culture of symphony orchestras is not for me. It is too uptight, stuffy. I'm a theater guy, and so I was then hired to run a brand new theater facility that was opened at the University of Hartford in Connecticut. And I was there for 5 years. And kind of an interesting story. As in many academic settings, when you interview for a job, you spend the whole day meeting people, having many interviews. And I met my boss near the end of the day, and he was the dean of the School of Music. And we did not like each other at all. And I thought, okay, this is not going to work out. And when I came out, the assistant dean who was escorting me asked me how it went. And I said, no, it didn't go well at all. We're like oil and water. And he said, ignore that. And I said, really? He says, no, I'm taking you now to meet the president of the university. And I went in to meet this guy, Steve Trachtenberg, and he was a dynamic, visionary individual who said, we just built this theater. We need somebody to do something with it. You're our man. And I said, yeah, but what about this guy over here? And he said, I said, can't I report to you instead? He said, I can't have everybody report to me in the university. He says, but my door will always be open to you. And, I will support you. So it was a very fruitful 5 years, and I developed a program in which I imported touring theater from the regional theaters of America, as well as some off-Broadway plays. At that time, so this was in the early 80s, regional theaters and off-Broadway did some touring. Today, none of that really happens. It's too expensive, and even then it was starting to wane. But we brought in the Guthrie Theater from Minneapolis every year. We brought in the American Repertory Theater, Robert Brustein's company. We had an interesting situation where I had been asked to interview the artistic directors of the main regional theaters in Connecticut for a publication. And one of them was Lloyd Richards, the head of Yale's Repertory Theater and Yale School of Drama. And so I got to know all of these leaders, but Lloyd said to me, Rick, do you think that New Haven and Hartford are too close? Would you ever consider bringing one of our productions up to Hartford? And I said, I would love to. He said, well, let's think about it and maybe in the future. And about a year later, we had a play fall out of our schedule. And I called him up and said, we have a slot. Do you have a production for me? And he said, I'll send you the script, but it's a new work by an unknown playwright. And I just don't think you're going to go for it, but it looks like it would probably fit in the schedule. He sent me Ma Rainey's Black Bottom by August Wilson, who of course became the, Pulitzer Prize winning, many award-winning, multiple award-winning chronicler of African-American life through his dramatic works. Decades, each decade was chronicled in a different play. And this was his first important play to arrive on the scene. It moved on to Broadway from Yale. But before it went to Broadway, it came to my theater. And they were so happy that it did, because it was sold out at Yale. And all of these Broadway producers wanted to come up and see it, and they could not get into Yale to see it. So they had to drive the extra hour to come to my theater to see it. And then they became backers of its Broadway run. So, and I got to know August Wilson, and what a wonderful man he was. And Lloyd, by the way, was also the head of the Eugene O'Neill Theater Center, the National Playwrights Conference during the summer. So I used to go to that, and that's where August Wilson's works were developed. But a number of years later, I actually was offered to be the head of the Eugene O'Neill Theater Center. And I interviewed with Lloyd in New York, and I interviewed with George White in Waterford, Connecticut. But by that time, I was pretty well established here in California. So after 5 years in Hartford, and there were many wonderful productions. I did produce a few. I began to produce and also direct some shows there to fill out the schedule. But ultimately, the university had some financial downturns in enrollment, and were not going to support as robustly the program. So I started to look around, and my wife and I had visited California, loved it. And I was offered to be a managing director of Shakespeare Festival here in Orange County, California. And pretty early on, it was clear that was not a good fit with the artistic director and founder. So within 3 years, I was offered to be the executive director of the Laguna Playhouse in Laguna Beach. Now, Laguna Playhouse was already a 70-year-old theater company that was an amateur company. It was founded in 1920, and it had a fairly sizable budget for an amateur theater, about $700,000 a year operating budget. And I came in and I saw the great potential there. And without going into too much detail, it really needed to be transformed into a professional theater. And I did that over a number of years. And I was there over 17 years as its executive director. By the time I left, we had a $7 million annual operating budget, and we had staff, and we produced 2 national touring productions, including Copenhagen, the Michael Frayn play, and we co-produced with other theaters. The interesting thing about that is, and I know that you were eager to learn a little bit about maybe the state of American theater a little bit through this conversation. American theater is not like theater in other countries in a lot of ways, and it just is reflective of the capitalistic society that we live in here. The culture and the perception of entertainment versus art, and the pressures that exist for any kind of artistic endeavor to be commercialized, And so at that theater, prior to my arriving there were some seasons where they did not just 1, but 2 Neil Simon plays. And yes, Neil Simon, a great comedic writer and all of that. But by the time I got there in the early 90s, Neil Simon was considered very passé, and he was at the end of his career, really, in terms of his best writing. And yet that was the audience that existed at that theater and had those expectations. So rather than a revolution artistically, we instituted an evolution. And over time, we gradually diversified the programming in such a way that more contemporary work could be done, more work that was serious in nature, serious art, And eventually, we also started a program of commissioning new works and producing premieres. And by the time I left, we were doing that. And I feel very proud of that. But still, you know, our summers, during the summer period, when the tourists come to Laguna Beach, we would always do very commercial stuff in order to make money to pay for the serious art the rest of the year. And so our greatest hit was called I Love You, You're Perfect, Now Change. And that was an off-Broadway hit musical. We produced the West Coast premiere, and we sold out 64 performances, grossed over $1 million, put a new roof on our theater, recarpeted, repainted, put new air conditioning in the building. You know, there still had to be, you know, this homage to the commercial tastes in our audience in order to retain them. And you know, not all of them liked the other works that we did. And we just tried to be as eclectic as possible in our selections so that, you know, if somebody didn't like one work on the season, there were bound to be other plays that they did, you know. So that's the practicality of running theater in America in large respect. But there came a time by the end of it where the commercial pressures were definitely afflicting me. And, you know, as a nonprofit organization, the theater had a board of directors. And while the board was always very supportive of me, there were some people who were not by the end of my tenure. And I felt it was time to go. And some of them thought it was time for me to go. So we parted company. And it was around that time that we met, because I came to Isradrama after I had left the Playhouse. And the last play that I produced and directed at Laguna was Master of the House by Shmuel Hasfari, the Israeli playwright. And the interesting thing about that particular play was that it was a big commercial hit for the Comrie Theater, the main municipal theater in Tel Aviv. And yet it had these subtle underpinnings to it that were quite evident to Israeli audiences in particular, maybe not so much to American audiences. So it was interesting to see how people reacted to it. But it was a play about a husband and wife where the wife decides she wants to remodel their historic Bauhaus apartment, and the husband does not want to touch anything. Nothing must change in his life. But you learn that their son had been killed, their little boy had been killed in a terrorist attack on the Dizengoff Mall. It was the famous attack that had taken place. And that the wife, the mother, felt the need to no longer grieve, but time to move on. And the husband was just so mired in grief that he could not move on. And so they part ways at the very end of the play. Even though throughout the play, there are many laughs, it's lots of comedic scenes with wonderful characters. You know, I even had the opportunity to do one of the things that many people, many directors always enjoy, to do a sight gag of, they had a character who was a handyman and plumber. And I was able to have him on his knees working on the toilet with his back to the audience, and what we call the plumber's crack, that his pants had slid down a bit and you could see the crack in his ass. And just, you know, the audience roars at, you know, those sorts of sight gags. And it was in keeping with the play. It was not, you know, violating some sanctity to the play, because there was a considerable comedy. But anyway, that was my last production that I directed there. But one of the plays that you and I saw in Isradrama, which was the Palestinian one-man play, and it was called In Spitting Distance.
Yes.
And I was able to, Ari Roth from the Theater J at the time in Washington, D.C., who was also at the conference, had established a series in Washington called New Voices from a Changing Middle East. And they were mostly, readings or solo performances in cafes. And in fact, this the owner of the cafe was an Iraqi emigre to the United States. And he was eager to foster intercultural understanding and put a stage in every one of his cafes that he created. The cafes are called Poets and Busboys. So we did a production. Ari brought me in to stage a reading. Well, it was more than a reading. The actor actually memorized the whole play, so it was wonderful. The actor Mahmoud Ebrahimzadeh, of Persian background, who's a big actor in the Washington, D.C. area. So I felt very proud to be able to present that. But most of my theater activities have been eclipsed by the other professional work I do now. I occasionally direct stage readings of new works. I have a few playwrights whose work I particularly am fond of, and I even acted in a couple of them. I'm not an actor, but in these readings, it's hard to get, people, men of a certain age sometimes. So I was just the right age and for a couple of them, and had a lot of fun doing it. One-off, one performance stage readings. So today, my role now, after I'm in my 14th year as the president of Arts Orange County, and I've gone back to my earliest job of running an arts council for a community. Only Orange County is 3.2 million people here, and a very robust economy, very diverse community. It is about 60% non-white in Orange County, with the largest proportion being Latino, and the next largest being Asian, and of various backgrounds. The Latinos are mostly Mexican American. The Asians are primarily Vietnamese American who emigrated here, after the American War in Vietnam, although there's considerable populations of Korean Americans and Chinese, a lot of Chinese moving here now and settling in the United States. But what does an arts council do? We help the arts ecosphere in any way we can, and there's lots of different ways. I won't go into everything, but I'd say our biggest role is as an advocate for artists, arts organizations, arts education. And that means we speak up a lot publicly on behalf of the arts community. We try to influence legislation and funding for the arts on the federal, state, and local level. And in particular, during the COVID, when there were federal monies being made available to local government, we approached the leaders here, the elected officials, and asked them for money. And we were successful in getting a little bit to start. And then there was a second wave after a year of more federal money. And we were able to secure $5 million for the arts. And the county contracted with us to grant 1 million of it. So one of the districts contracted with us. So we also make some grants. We provide a lot of information. We maintain an inventory of all of the public art in the community, more than 1,000 works. We convene leaders of arts organizations of every cohort, so performing arts, museums, deans of arts colleges and universities, individual artists, therapeutic arts organizations, choral groups, all sorts of groups. And during the pandemic, it was a lot easier to do through Zoom. So we have had over the past 2 years, more than 100 Zoom meetings, convenings of these different groups. And often it's just an opportunity to share information with them, resources, opportunities, but also for them to, interact with their peers, meet their peers, many for the first time, and network. And in many cases, collaborations have emerged from that. So we feel very good about that. And then, unfortunately, an organization like ours, in most communities of size, would be funded by the government, or it might be an office within government. Los Angeles, San Francisco, San Diego are all that way. New York, most metropolitan areas, and around the world, it's like that. Not in Orange County, which has historically been libertarian in its political philosophy and not a believer in big government, and never believed that the arts should be funded by government. So although we have a very robust arts scene here with some major facilities, it's all been privately funded through philanthropy. Well, philanthropists don't get what an arts council does. And so to ask a philanthropist, would you please give to us so that we can have meetings of arts leaders? No, most philanthropists, they give because they love classical music, so they give to the symphony, or they love theater and they give to the repertory theater, or to opera, or to the museum. We have a few philanthropists who understand the importance of what we do, but and this organization, which I actually back in the 80s was one of the first committee to try to get it started, had a wonderful leader, a founding leader for 14 years, and she's a friend still. But she got to a point where there just was never any money. It was a constant struggle to sustain it. And so she retired. And one of the board members approached me, called me up and said, "Rick, what are you doing?" After I left the Laguna Playhouse. And we need you at Arts Orange County. So I came in and I said, well, look, I don't think I'm your man. I am a theater guy. I'm an egotistical producer, director. I want things my way. I don't want a board to tell me what to do. I just want a board that rubber stamps what I want and writes checks. And I just want to do it my own way. And one of the board members, this older guy, says to me, "Rick, that is exactly what we need." So it's true. What they needed at that point was kind of a different entrepreneurial approach, as opposed to a more formal, bureaucratic style and process-oriented style that was established. And so for better or for worse, that's how I run the organization. Some things are not as well organized as my predecessor had them. But one of the things that we did do was find a way to make some money to support so much of the things that we do, which are free or low in cost. And we discovered that cities and other potential clients need consulting services in the area of the arts. So right now, we actually have 7 different consulting contracts. And this now amounts to about 25 to 30% of our revenue each year. We have a very small budget here. We have about a $750,000 operating budget. Compared to the Laguna Playhouse, I'm back to where I began there. But we are preparing master arts plans for cities or public art policies. We're managing public art projects. We are now in our 7th year of managing a 14-acre sculpture park for the city of Newport Beach. We do management recruitment for arts organizations. We do strategic planning meetings that we facilitate for arts organizations. So there's lots of little things that we pick up work to do that it's an area of expertise that there aren't many others in our area. In Los Angeles, yes, but not so much in Orange County. And because of our reputation as the Arts Council, people trust us. And in general, as a nonprofit organization, we're able to offer it a little more affordably than, say, a commercial consulting group. So that's kind of where things are at here. You know, the advocacy, we're right on the cusp of breaking through with our county government to have some ongoing funding for the arts here for the very first time. And that's been the long time goal of this organization that has never achieved in 27 years. So if I am able to do that in the next couple of years and get it established, I will feel I've accomplished something here, and I will feel I can now retire. So, that's the story of that. But one other thing I didn't mention, one of my most formative experiences in the theater was in 1988, the International Theater Institute, United States, Martha Quanier, who ran it for many years, called me up and said, you know, when I was at the Shakespeare Festival in Garden Grove here in Orange County, there was a large Korean population. She said, I see you have an interest in, you know, building bridges with the Korean community. What if I send you to Seoul for 3 weeks on the ITI budget with the travel fellowship? And you can meet, there's some wonderful theater people who I know through ITI there, and you should see the work that they're doing. I said, wonderful. So I accepted. At that time, I got a call from the cultural attaché in the American Embassy in Seoul. And he said, I know you're coming, but I have to tell you, my boss, who is the head of USIA here in Seoul, does not believe in cultural exchange. And he has prohibited me from working on this in any way. He said, I can give you a list of some theater people I know, but you'll be totally on your own. He said, I'm really sorry. I wish I could be of more help. I said, don't worry. I'm a big boy. I can find a way. Well, around that time, Congressman Bob Dornan, who was this ultra right-wing congressman here in Orange County, was judging an art competition in our theater. He did this every year, and I had met him several times. And I said to him, Congressman, I'm going to be going to Korea in August. And he says to me, what Vietnam would be today if only we stuck to our guns. And I'm yes, oh, yes, yes. He said, you call my office in the morning, my chief of staff will help you. I know the ambassador to South Korea, and I'm sure we can help you. So, oh, wonderful. Well, a week later, the cultural attaché calls me up from Seoul, and he says, I don't know who you know, but everything has changed, and we will be doing things to manage your whole visit. Well, I was there for 3 weeks. I had a car and driver and interpreter provided to me. And the American Embassy held a reception for me with the entire theater community. Not at the embassy, mind you, because the theater people wouldn't be caught dead going to the American Embassy. Especially then, because they had just lifted censorship in Korea leading up to the Olympics. You may recall that there was censorship in Korea, in South Korea in 1987, and a number of countries said they were going to boycott the Olympics. So Korea lifted censorship. So during those 3 weeks, I saw 15 different theatrical productions. And this ranged from very traditional Korean opera and American-style musicals to a lot of political theater with the lid off on censorship. All of these plays were being staged that dealt with politics. And one of them I went to began with a demonstration on the street in front of the theater. And I was the only non-Korean in the audience there. And the whole play was anti-American. So it was a very interesting experience. You know, it certainly wasn't against me personally, but it was against the politics. Now, I had met the Korean cultural consul here in Los Angeles in their consulate. And he said, when you go, I have one important piece of advice. You must go see a shaman. And I said, really? He said, yes. All of Korean traditional theater is rooted in shaman rituals. I said, great. I said, how do I find one? He said, well, there's a professor at the Catholic University, Sogang University. He's a priest, and he's written about it. So he made the introduction. I visited the priest. The priest had a little map for me and said, well, these are a couple of places you might find one. And I said, well, I only have one day to do this on my schedule. Where am I most likely? And he pointed me in the direction. I come out of the hotel. This time I didn't have my car and driver this day. So I took a taxi. I go into the taxi, and the word for shaman in Korean is mudang. So I say to the taxi driver, please take me here on this map. And he's, why do you want to go there? And I said, I'm going to see the mudang. And he's like, mudang? Why do you want to see a mudang? And I said, just take me there, take me there. He would not take me there. The doorman comes out of the hotel. What's going on here? He wants to go there. And the doorman says, just take him, just take him. So it was actually not far, maybe 2 miles from my hotel in the heart of Seoul, up on a hill, this 3-room open air pagoda. And in the middle, central room, were stacks of food offerings. Pig's heads, fruits, vegetables, cakes. And there was a performance taking place there. And I could see the left-hand room had musicians and performers in it. But the right-hand room had a bunch of people just sitting on the floor, smoking cigarettes and drinking and playing cards. And I said, that's the room I want. So I go to that room and I sit down. Those were the shamans. Those were the mudangs. And they were waiting for customers to come in. And one of them spoke pretty good English. He had been in the military. And then there were, and next to him was this very old woman, a shaman, with almost no teeth. And she starts to ask me questions. She said, so where are you from? I said, America. And I said, she said, great, great. I love America. I said, good, good. And she said, and are you married? And I said, yes. She says, oh, good, good. How many wives do you have? And I said, one. And she said, oh, only one? I like America. I'd like to go to America. I'd like to move to America. So this 80-year-old shaman was coming on to me. Anyway, people would come in. I saw a young woman come in with a wad of bills of cash, hand it to the shaman, saying her father's spirit does not rest. He died last year. she hears him and feels him walking around her house. And so then they had performances. They had musicians, they had actors, dancers doing these very ritualistic, formulaic kinds of works. And I sat there for 3 hours watching all of this go on. And another customer would come in and they would do a ceremony, and another customer and another ceremony. And yes, it was very similar to some of the traditional performances that I saw in Seoul. And I always was grateful to that Korean cultural attaché for saying, this is a must. In order to understand our culture and the roots of our theater, this is it. And that's what it's all about, Tariq. It's cultural understanding and the role that the arts play and the theater plays in making that happen.
Oh, very. The first 4 letters of your name, Richard, is rich, and you have had a rich life.
Indeed.
And wonderful, and many more years ahead. I don't think you'll ever retire. No. I've retired from Istanbul Metropolitan Theater, but on paper. But people like us, we're always active and doing things, and trying to do good things in spite of all the odds. And I would like to ask a few more questions. Thank you for answering the questions that I had sent previously. Before I ask, I would like to say a few things about some of the things you mentioned in relation to them. In Spitting Distance was one of the striking plays that I watched as well.
Yes. And I'm sorry, I forgot to mention the name of the playwright, Taher Najib.
Taher Najib, yes. And I'm so, he was also the actor, wasn't he?
No, they had, Taher Najib created it for himself, but Taher lives in Ramallah.
Ah, yes.
And so he could not perform it in Israel, but it was, I forget the actor's name, it is a
yes.
Palestinian Israeli actor who performed it, yes.
Yes. And I'm glad you brought that wonderful, striking play to the attention of American Earthmates. I enjoy using this Earthmate. You mentioned Eugene O'Neill, and these days I'm editing a Turkish translation of a play by Eugene O'Neill. Jane Warner and I have preparing 4 American plays that have been translated into Turkish by Professor Talat Halman, late professor, and it will be published in Turkey, saying American drama on Turkish stage. And there is a play by Eugene O'Neill as well, and The Iceman Cometh. And another thing is,
that's a great undertaking for you to pursue. It's a long,
yes,
deep play.
It is. And I've translated Arthur Miller's, to me, the best play, Mr. Peter's Connections. 20 years ago, it's been published in Turkish.
Really?
Not performed in Turkey yet, unfortunately. You mentioned Beckett with a friend we translated Waiting for Godot into Turkish. He from the French, me from, of course, the English. It's it's considered to be the best translation of that play, and it's used. One of the plays that influenced me very much in Tel Aviv was Savyon Liebrecht's play on Hanna Arendt and Heidegger, which was The Banality of Love. And I translated it into Turkish, and in 2012 it was staged by the Istanbul State Theatre or National Theatre. I've written a monodrama based on the diary of Anna Frank. People tend to say Anne Frank, but my Jewish friend, composer Daniel Galay, insists on Anna, which I also prefer. In Turkish, we say Anna Frank, Anna Frank. And so a monodrama. And then I revised the monodrama as a relationship between Otto Frank and Anna. So it's a play for two characters. Otto Frank remembers. We have two pieces. So with a young actress, I performed Otto Frank in his I have what I call the amateur theater of professionals that I started. And some of my plays, they never bring money. So, and they are too marginal to be staged by sponsored theaters or whatever. Mm-hmm. So my own theater, we take care of that with, very few performances, but as long as it's done, it's fine. In Turkey, we still need government, what's the word, subsidy? Yes. Yes. For example, without that, we wouldn't have opera. Because in Turkey, private enterprise that upholds art has been marginal. There are a few strong companies who support arts and festivals, such as Eczacıbaşı, especially, and but without the municipalities and the state, we wouldn't have an opera, or we wouldn't have theater with for big number of actors, let's say. So we still want.
I'm sure that there are some constraints on what you can do in the content of theater that is subsidized by the state. Under the Erdogan regime, it's not.
Even that, I mean, it is still relatively protected, especially the theaters subsidized by municipalities.
Yes.
But of course, you have a point there. I mean, there is a hidden pressure somewhere that may not have been uttered openly, but then you feel it, and probably some self-censorship or limitation is taking place. I understand you. You're right. So I just wanted to touch those. And one of the things I want to do is to have my monodrama of Anna Frank to be performed in Gaza by a Palestinian girl. Because I feel puzzled, and unhappy about the limitations and certain oppression our Palestinian earthmates are suffering, unfortunately, as you know.
Yes.
And just as our Kurdish, many Kurdish earthmates are suffering in Turkey and elsewhere in the Middle East, wherever there is oppression, people like you and me, we want to do something good for liberation.
Yes.
This is this is an episode, this interview, one of the, what I call Earth civilization dialogues, as I mentioned before, because in spite of all the difficulties and negativities, some good energies, synergies, of which I think both of us are part. We are developing something, a culture, a civilization based on the awareness of the limitations of our home planet and the possibilities of synergy. And the solution cannot come from anywhere else, I think, but only from ourselves. And bad guys can unite and attack easily. And yes, it's so easy to destroy. But good guys, we need better synergy, I think, to confront the aggression of bad guys and to improve the alternative globalization. When 20 years ago I was invited, I didn't speak about globalization, although the present globalization has been in favor of capitalism, etc. The alternative is not limiting oneself to one's locality. I like the concept of glocal, and we say küyerel, küre, globe, and yerel, local. That attitude, yes, we are everywhere at the same time, and everything is influencing us. So that's why this modest Earth Civilization Network, now there are about 50, 60 Earthmates from various places, and we meet once a month on a Sunday morning, very early for you, actually 7 in your time.
That's not early for me. I have a cat.
Okay. So whenever you wish, you'll always be welcome. I mean, we share.
It sounds wonderful.
For example, what's going on in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, elsewhere in Africa, Niger. So this is history, actually, activists in action from various fields. And trustworthiness is one of the most important things in life. So that's why when I look at behind, and whoever you trust, I trust, of course.
Yes.
So I hope such synergies will grow, similar stuff. We need to be intercultural. Otherwise, how can we improve? How can we multicultural, etc., etc.? So I just wanted to share with you some of the thoughts that you already know in a way. But pessimism, I think, is unethical. Because I mean, people who are in danger, they don't have the luxury to be pessimistic. They have to fight for their survival.
It's Beckett.
Yeah, well.
Try, fail, try again, fail better.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. And to my Croatian friend, Vladimir Bogdanic, who's trying to help some Ukrainian family, is one of the interviews is with him. He said, I don't he wrote to me, I don't have time for losers, mentioning about some people. And I said, only who quit struggle are losers. He says, definitely. And what are some of your thoughts about today's world? And what are your wishes? And specifically about to the young Earthmates, yes. What would you like to suggest? I mean, or give advice. Giving advice is not a hierarchical position, I think. It could be, but it's our also duty. We have, in a way, you know.
Well, the most important piece of advice is, you know, what you've just been talking about is do not despair. Despair is the enemy, you know, because now, yes, some great art has emerged from despair. And to me, it has certainly a therapeutic value to work through it creatively. And yet, I just am amazed at the younger artists that and entrepreneurs, creative spirits out there who are doing such interesting work and coming up with new ideas. And, you know, to me, art is all about telling stories, theater especially, but telling stories. And there's just other stories to be told that are, you know, not from my generation. And yes, there are stories that are universal, told in every generation too, but in different forms. But the stories that I hear from, particularly in the US right now, where you have not just the division politically, but you have a tremendous upheaval by non-white people against systemic racism. And a lot of white people are, you know, joining that campaign as well. But it's something, that very forceful movement that is taking place is very jarring for, you know, those of us who have worked our way through the system to get where we are, not just white people, but also non-white people who have, you know, played by the rules to get where they are, and now are grappling with impatience on the part of a new generation who are not willing to wait, not willing to work their way through the system, but want to, you know, dismantle the system or create a new system that enables them. So that is being given voice creatively, you know, through fiction, through poetry, through theater, through music and dance. And it's very gratifying to see that. And, you know, there's some very, very good work being done. And to me, I think what's shocking to me is the fact that America has been very unreceptive to political theater over the years. You know, visual arts is a little bit different. Conceptual art and political art has been able to thrive in galleries and museums a little bit more. But you know, the business model of theater is such that, as we say, you have to have butts in seats. So, you know, as I said in my college days in New York, there was a flowering of some political theater that went on at that time, but that eventually went away too. And maybe it was just that, you know, that generation stopped being so angry and wanting change of everything as they matured. But I was amazed when the Belarus Free Theater came to Orange County several years ago, to see their work. And, it was the cognoscenti who came out to see it, of course, all the people who understood why this was important, but nobody else came. The regular theater going public had no clue why this was an important company to come see. And in fact, that whole festival, there was for a few years a festival of new works and edgy works being done by our main performing arts center. And the houses were almost always very sparsely attended. And it was really too bad because some of the most creative work was being done there. So political theater has never thrived in the United States. And I just think it's too bad, whereas in other countries, I know it does. And yes, there are places where it's repressed as well. I do remember one of our colleagues at Isradrama was Anna Lakos from Budapest. And she was a dramaturg with the Hungarian Drama Institute. And when my brother and I took my elderly mother and our wives and kids, took my elderly mother to Hungary, I believe it was 2010 maybe, because that's where her roots were, and she had never been there. And so we took her to Budapest and we took her to Miskolc, and it was an amazing experience because we went to the synagogue in Miskolc, and she said that she understood her family was from there, but she didn't know anything about it. And at the synagogue, the president of the synagogue brought down a book from the shelf that had births and deaths in it, and it had her family's name in there. So it was this great validation that these stories she heard as a little girl of her family coming from there were true. But one day, my wife and I had coffee with Anna from the Drama Institute. We visited her in her office, and she closed the door, and she had an assistant in there. And she said, we're going to go off site to have our coffee and talk. I just wanted you to meet my assistant here. She and I are both from the same village. I said, oh, what village is that? Where is it located in Hungary? No, we're both from the same village. And I'm like, oh, same tribe. So we go out for coffee. And she said, we can't talk there in the building. We go out for coffee at a nearby cafe. And this was, the first time that Fidesz took power politically in Hungary. And then they were not out of power, and then they came back and now have been in. But the Orban government, she said, the head of the National Theater is gay, and he is being driven out of his job because it's a political appointment. It's the state theater, and the government appoints that position. She said, anti-Semitism has risen up again. She said, this is why, she said, I have to be very careful at work. And so, and she had other stories, but this is, so I imagine that political theater is not thriving in Hungary today. I don't know what you hear or know about it. I'm not as, familiar with what's going on, but when I was in Korea on that trip, I had an interesting experience too, when I met the head of the underground theater that had operated before they lifted the censorship. And they operated in the south bank of the Han River there, which is the factory district. And all the factory workers live in their, poor hovels. And he would not meet me down there. He came to my hotel and we sat in the lobby, and he kept looking around the whole time. And I said, well, how does it feel now that censorship has been lifted, he said, we are still very cautious. And he told me about how they would hold plays in people's homes, and they would get the word out 1 hour prior to the performance where it was going to take place, in order to stay one step ahead of the police, who often arrested them and shut them down. And he said they were still very cautious. He was still very afraid. So to me, that's something that I think a lot of Americans in the arts don't really appreciate. We don't think that much about censorship or that kind of oppression of thought and creativity. Our oppression is that will it make money? Will it pay the bills? It's that, you want to have a hit. You want to have a hit where lots of people come see it and you make some money off of it. And so you don't go, there's very few hits that ever exceed boundaries. And if they do, they're generally not political. You have something like Hamilton on Broadway, of course. Well, how political is that really? Yes, it is political in some ways, but it's still, it was able to capture the zeitgeist and provide some kind of anchor for a more traditional theater-going audience. Although maybe not Mike Pence, because I remember he walked out of it at the end. He attended it because he had a granddaughter, I believe, who took him to see it, and when he was vice president, and he did not like it, but at the end when he was leaving, Lin-Manuel Miranda on stage called out to him and wanted to say some things to him, but the vice president did not remain in the theater to hear it. So that's the closest I think that we come in America to political theater. And I'm sure it's difficult in those countries who are undergoing true oppression to be able to fulfill their freedom of expression in a way that I don't think we've ever really had to worry about here. And in some ways that's a good thing, but it's also, we don't value it in the same way that we would if we had experienced that.
Yes, I agree. There are 2 points that came to my mind. One of them, of course, is the great Israeli Jewish composer Daniel Galai, and I have an interview with him as well. He and we wrote Dancing and Anna Frank. I wrote the lyrics based on the diary, and he composed it. It's minimalistic, 1 piano, a dancer, or a soprano. So I consider it a chamber opera. It's about 1 hour. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to attend the performance in Tel Aviv 6 years ago. I hope it can be widespread. But in Turkey, we are under more and more oppression, of course, in terms of arts and theater and elsewhere. I want to mention that. It's, for example, Carmina Burana, about 6 years ago, was unofficially banned because when it was revealed by a newspaper that some of the words, although in Latin, were a bit erotic, there was a reaction to it, and believe it or not, this should make a headline. Carmina Burana is banned in Turkey, actually.
Oh.
This gives an idea. I was threatened because of the Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves, the opera. My genius Turkish composer Selman Ada and I, we wrote 34 years ago. And there, the thieves called their chief. And somebody claimed that we had put the word chief, reis in Turkish, to imply Erdogan. So we had to prove that 34 years ago, we had written it like that. And still, the Islamofascist newspaper, in spite of our explanation, put my name as attacking unfairly to our opera. Because that's dangerous, because although officially nothing is done, the people they provoke, some ignorant people might have attacked us or whatever. You know, this is
yes, absolutely.
And so in Turkey, there is a regime that I call Erdocracy, combining Erdogan and
yes.
It's a sort of Islamofascism. It's Erdocracy, and I am angry at some of my comrades who expected democratization from him, especially some of my Western friends. 20 years ago, they were too optimistic. They said he would get rid of the militaristic approach of the Turkish state. I said, no, he wants to build his own militarism, which is happening. And unfortunately, the US strategy supported him, brought him to that's another issue. But I've always been critical since my youth, for about more than 50 years, of all the governments who do misdeeds, including, of course, primarily the Turkish governments and, of course, the US government elsewhere, the Soviet, now Russian, etc. But I have never been anti-American. I have never been anti any nation or any society. And I strongly think that if we need a second renaissance in the world, the good potential of the American society must be a part of it. Without the good potential in the United States, it's not possible to. So this is. It's important not to confuse the elements, not to.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, so I just wanted to make these things. I wanted to make these remarks, especially. Well, is there anything else you would like to add at this point?
No, I guess just one thing, because if anyone does get this far listening to our conversation, you and I also did not share what In Spitting Distance is about.
Yes.
And one of the things that I really loved about that play was that here is this everyman character depicted in that he is feeling confined, and the atmosphere is so oppressive in Ramallah, and he sees everybody standing around on the corner, men and boys spitting. And there was nothing to do, no work, or very little work. And the theater was not satisfying him anymore, his work as an actor. So he decides to go on vacation and flies to Paris. And it is there where he is exulting in the atmosphere of Paris He falls in love with a woman and they have a relationship there. But after a few weeks, he is homesick and he wants to go home to his cat. Zuzu is the name of the cat. He discovers that the day he is flying to Tel Aviv from Paris, because you can't fly from Ramallah to Paris and back, you have to go through Israel, is the first anniversary of 9/11. And that's what his airline ticket is for. And he just knows that as a Palestinian traveling on that day, his life will be hell. And he opts to take this very Zen attitude of not allowing anything to bother him and going with the flow. And yes, he's detained a couple of times for questioning, even upon his arrival back in Tel Aviv. But he still has his dignity. And one of the funniest scenes is when he talks about getting on the plane in Paris, where he's been detained and they've held the flight for him. And of course, everybody on that plane is like, why are we not taking off yet? He finally comes on and his seat is at the back of the plane. So he must walk the entire length of the plane and encounter the stares of everyone already seated who look at him and know this man is going to blow up our plane. And it's one of those black humor, macabre moments of theater and he decides he will just stride proudly from the front of the plane to his seat. And you say, yes, go for it, man. This is your humanity. This is your dignity at stake here. And just a beautiful piece. And I was so taken by it. But I remember the story also was, even though we saw it at the Comrie, it was not a Comrie production because Ophira, I forget her last name, who directed it, an Israeli woman.
Ofra.
Yeah, she and Taher agreed they did not want to have it in a state, produced by a state subsidized theater. They didn't want it in a traditional theater because they feared both sides. They didn't want the opprobrium of, the right wing in Israel or the radical, Palestinian militant attitude either. They felt it would endanger them too if they did. So they did it in small venues all around Israel. And I had written an article for American Theater magazine upon my return, which I think I may have shared with you. It's already, 2008, that article came out, but it was about Isradrama and the plays we saw and the fact that so many of the plays at the time were about the relationship between Israelis and Palestinians, even on the institutional stages. And that one of the people I spoke with was the director of the original production many years earlier of Romeo and Juliet that had been a co-production of the theater in Jerusalem, I forgot what it's called, and the theater in Ramallah. And the two artistic directors did this, and it was, quite an endeavor for them to do this. But it ultimately, ran into many difficulties and was shut down. And the director said they fear to have a photo of that production at the Ramallah Theater. It's too dangerous for them to show that they take pride in having done that play, and that is such a sad commentary to me about this.
Yes, and actually it was a very wise, I didn't know about this, but a great idea to have Palestinians and Jews, Israeli Jews, working together in Romeo and Juliet, because
yes,
perfect play to I mean, I can't think of a better classic than that. Wonderful.
So I wrote about that and the other experiences in this article, and predictably letters to the editor in the magazine, were critical of it being anti-Israeli, especially with such a large, the theater community in New York is very heavily Jewish too. And so there's still a lot of that attitude, reactionary attitudes about it. But it ultimately spoke about how many of the works we saw were Israeli theaters trying to speak for the Palestinians, because except for In Spitting Distance, none of the works were really Palestinian works. There was the one we saw in Jaffa, which was a joint production of an Arab. And
I was going to mention that. It was also courageous and very good.
Yeah, it was called, what was it? Winter at Kalandia, which was the checkpoint, the Kalandia checkpoint between Ramallah and Israel. It was kind of an amateurish piece and production, but it pinpointed a really important experience.
Perfect. It symbolized the very project itself meant a lot.
Then there was the, I don't remember the name of it, but there was a play which we also saw at the Comrie, which was more of a satire. It was intended as a satire, but it's where this Israeli couple invite an Arab couple over for dinner. And it's very amusing because the wife totally doesn't understand them. And the fact that, first of all, the Arab couple are not Muslim, but they are Christian. So she declines to serve them any alcohol. And they said, no, we drink alcohol. No, you must not, And then that's the one also where there's a scene set where the security wall in Israel is built through the house of a Palestinian family, and they must cross the border to get to the bathroom. And so not everything was funny, but satire isn't always funny. But
that's right.
Anyway, I'll send you that article again. I just pulled it up to show somebody recently. I am going to have to go shortly. So yeah, it's been wonderful, Tariq. And do show that photo of us.
Yes.
The cheek pinching. It was wonderful. And that was such a brief, we only had about an hour or so in that cafe. You were traveling, I think, later that day.
Yes.
So I can't wait to have the chance to visit you in Turkey. And if you ever come out to California, let me know.
And if you ever text us, let me know.
Probably not likely, but let's keep in touch and let me know about, how to connect with your Sunday meetings.
Wonderful.
Of your Earthmates.
I will send you. Yes, I will send you, and everybody will be happy with your synergic approach. Everybody, thank you so much. We're together.
Oh, my pleasure. We'll talk again soon.
I enjoy saying we're together at the end of this.
We are together. Okay. Take care. Bye-bye.
so much.